All right, YouTube, the Brexit vote is coming up still, more and more every day. We draw near that fateful time at which the UK will determine whether it wants to continue getting screwed by foreigners. By that I mean, bureaucrats. I'm not even talking about immigrants right now. Or whether it wants to actually determine its own future and not be sort of enslaved to this weird concept of Europe as a homogenized continent. As before, I encourage people to vote to leave the European Union. To anyone who is in the UK who watches my channel, I really hope you are intending to vote, and I hope that you vote leave. It would be beneficial for the UK. I don't want to see the people of the UK screwed. I have, of course, had spats with many British folk who thought that I was some sort of racist because I was chuckling about how Sadiq Khan was calling moderate Muslims Uncle Toms, then ranting about how many white men there were on, I guess, the Transport Authority for London some time ago. I don't really care, though, because my general assumption is if somebody thinks that my statements there were racially motivated, which they clearly weren't, then they must be way out in left field. They must be, I don't know, an anarcho punk or something similar to that, or a Communist Party member, or a Muslim, let's face it, because, of course, like evangelical Christians celebrating when a candidate that rants about Jesus all day wins, I would expect that Islamists would enjoy the fact that the mayor of London is a devout religious Muslim. And he can claim up and down all day that he's not, but I can see through that because he's a fucking politician. People appear to ignore that. I find it funny. But the EU just adds another layer of stupidity onto governments that are already having their own problems within Europe. I think Europe worked better when it was unified by simply a sort of voluntary association and military alliance, let's face it, against the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union. In those days, things were working fine, but now that the Soviet Union's gone, you have tighter and tighter bureaucratic control over the European Union, and it's clearly not working. Anyone that thinks the European Union is working just fine, my goodness, half of the news stories out of Europe, they're not about the new cheese that was developed or a new art showcase by some famous Frenchman, or a new culinary delight, or how the radishes bloomed early this year or something like that. It's not like it was in the past. Even when I was like a kid, when we looked at European cultures, we thought of the glimmering lights of Paris and the London fog and things like that. Now, when I think of Europe, I think of a deeply troubled continent that's increasingly dividing among partisan lines. The problem is the EU is doomed. As I said before yesterday in my video, the reason it's doomed is because you have two de facto blocks of nations lining up against one another, those that want to preserve what they see as a more traditional culture, and those that are led by people like Merkel or Hollande, who don't really care about the concept of a native culture. They simply want cheap labor, or they just want to import people that will vote for their political parties. This is causing alienation between these states. It's not a matter of when the EU breaks down, it's a matter of which side leaves first. If the UK votes to leave the EU, it can destroy the entire rotten mess. A new system can be created, one that's more amicable, one that's more fair to the member states, one that actually works, one that takes into consideration the fact that it's not 2 or 3 decades ago. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The idea of a currency bloc is obviously not working. The UK chose, I believe, to retain the pound anyway, so maybe that's not so much of a problem. But essentially, it's being left up to a few tens of millions of people living in the UK, whether the EU drags along and gets worse and worse and creates more social alienation down the road, or whether it begins to dissolve literally this year. And I hope that my faith in the people of the UK to cut the head off the snake and destroy the EU before it gets even more out of hand is not misplaced. I hope they make that decision. The EU clearly is dysfunctional at this point. The level of alienation will increase. Things will not get better. There is no magical solution to the problems being spawned by the bureaucrats running the EU or by any of these strong-arm folks such as Merkel who want to ride roughshod over other member states. The reason why there's no solution is because when you have an authoritarian system built, a collective system of states with some sort of overarching authority given certain powers, the natural tendency of those that are within those positions is to add more and more layers of control to patch up any holes that they see sprung in the ship of state, or in this case, the ship of many states. But that doesn't work, because any time government tries to patch up such a problem, it creates additional leaks. This is how the ship ultimately sinks. The United States is having to have a hearty discussion right now. There's a reason why those that believe, as I do, in a much more limited, constrained government are beginning to rise up in number rapidly across the board. So, a double-digit total of Americans now align themselves with what only a decade ago was considered perhaps the most fanatic of constitutional movements. Now it's seen as sort of more balanced, more pragmatic, I guess, under the leadership of somebody like Gary Johnson. But if you had told people the platform of the Libertarian Party a couple decades ago, they would have assumed that you were either the Republican partisan would call you a communist, the Democratic partisan would call you a fascist, and they would leave it at that. They wouldn't be receptive. Now, of course, we know that's no longer the case. The message has grown. Hopefully, we win over the people of the United States, and we can restore our republic, take it further away from tyranny, sort of fix Rome before the Roman Senate falls and it just becomes an imperium led by some crazy Caesar who may be good, may be bad, and at all times is going to be an authoritarian dictator. The EU is going to end up going in the same direction. You see Merkel essentially running the show, alienating other states, making bad decisions, mixing her messages up, and on one day she'll say how great mass immigration is. The next day she seems to recant that statement and say multiculturalism isn't necessarily working so well. I mean, maybe she's losing her marbles because of the problems within her own country. Maybe there's still a pang of wanting to preserve actual Germany left in her, and that's continually getting her heartstrings are being twanged over and over every time she sees that someone has been fickied by an economic refugee. No, I would suggest that the people of the UK vote to leave the EU, because it will speed up the process that's already inevitable, which is the dissolution of what currently exists there, and the reformation of something that treats these states fairly, that gives them the ability to actually run their own states in such a way that essentially what you need an alliance across Europe in which amicable relations are assured, diplomacy is key, people try to work things out through negotiation. Obviously, nobody wants to see another great war or something like that. That wouldn't be good for anybody in this world. When Europeans start going to war, it tends to be quite catastrophic. We know this. The Europeans tend to be peace-loving, but when they start fighting, the full war machine comes out, and things just get all manner of fucked up, and you wouldn't even want to see it like a modern land war in that continent today. I don't think that will happen, by the way. The problem is, if you continue to increase the alienation present spawned by the EU, if you continue down this dark path of making sure these states slowly grow to hate one another on an ethnic and nationalistic basis, there will be fighting between them. You won't even be able to preserve an open border situation. I find it funny. It seems like there are those in Europe that are more concerned about other groups of Europeans moving in than people from the third world being invited in by a handful of member states, in which they end up simply filtering out across open borders into every other state. I mean, it's astonishing to me that people actually think that way. I would think that you would want more Eastern Europeans in your country. Now, they seem like decent people, and they actually have an appreciation for civilized culture, as opposed to people who don't intend to work, or their idea of work is essentially crime, or they simply want to blow things up. But apparently there are those in Europe who think that makes me, or somebody who thinks like me in Europe, a bigot. Well, I disagree. I don't think that it's bigoted at all for a people to want to preserve what they have, because Europe was not built on the American principle of take all comers, or take all comers at least if they're civilized. Europe was built on the ethno-state principle many centuries ago. Many of these nations had their origins. They weren't built on the concept of, yeah, we'll take in, a million people from this faraway country. No, back then they would enslave them, or they'd take their resources, or they'd conquer them and try to civilize them or something. I find it very funny that only a few generations ago, what's going on in Europe today would have been considered so morally reprehensible it would have led to civil war. And yet today, people have been convinced that the opposite is true, that what happened in the past was morally reprehensible, that this is some sort of moral crusade to make up for, I guess, European guilt or something. Well, it's not going to make up for European guilt to destroy your own cultures remaining in the EU, which is obviously failing. If you're pro-immigrant in Europe, you don't need to be in the EU in order to accept immigrants. The EU doesn't facilitate that. It just makes it possible for somebody like Merkel to bring in millions of people through her buddies in Turkey, I guess, and filter them out across other states to weaken them, to gain more economic control, which appears to be mostly what Merkel's doing. I think she likes the instability. I think she likes the fighting. I think she rubs her hands together at the end of the day, thinking about the misery of people in other states other than her own, and she laughs at it. That's my summation of what Merkel appears to me to be like, a humorless, mechanistic, strange woman, a total weirdo, ultimately, who in any halfway decent situation would have been removed from office a long time ago. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. The German people are like, I guess, in La La Land or something. But the UK doesn't need that bullshit. The UK is already like best ally of the United States. You don't need to hang with these other losers over there in Europe. You can hang with us instead. Nobody's gonna fuck with you. Nobody's gonna treat you badly. It's just not gonna happen. You're a nuclear state anyway. So why the fuck are you afraid of the concept of leaving a bloated bureaucratic system that doesn't even really represent your values? It just doesn't make sense. Like, when you begin to amalgamate totally disparate groups of people with totally different beliefs, like Far East European, formerly under the USSR, desperately afraid of like socialism and communism, complete nationalist, traditionalist, don't give a fuck about diversity, and somebody in Western Europe, decadent, never under communism, probably feels positively towards like Joseph Stalin or something, and thinks that, you need more people from the third world for some unknown economic reason that they never quite get around to explaining. When you begin lumping these people together and trying to rule them through one system, it's not going to work well. You will piss off one side or the other, no matter what you do. That's fundamentally why the EU is doomed. So yes, vote for the Brexit. Vote leave. That's my message to the UK. I know I'm not in the UK, but I do have a vested interest here. Most of my ancestry comes from England and to an extent from Scotland. So I do feel positively towards the UK. I do want to see it preserved in some manner or form. I don't want to see this, island turn into basically nothing, a wasteland of stupidity under the auspices of Merkel and her buddies in the EU. It wouldn't make sense. It's like erasing my own ancestry. Even if I never met those people, they were over here in the Americas by the 1600s, it doesn't matter. It's still that same ancestral lineage, which there's a threat to actually wipe it off the face of the earth under this weird system. Even homogenizing just European people into one sort of blob would erase all of these ancestries. You wouldn't have Poland and the UK and France and all of these things. You'd simply have Europe. Well, that's boring. That's fucking boring as hell. What's the purpose of it? It doesn't make any sense. These nations can trade and negotiate and talk with one another and travel freely and have all these things without having an EU. And to people in the UK who are afraid, oh, well, if we leave the EU, the other Europeans will gang up on us. No, they won't, and I'll tell you why. Because the second the UK leaves the EU, other nations will begin holding votes. And I'd bet everything that at least half of them will vote to leave the EU as well. They might want to form a bloc with the UK as opposed to a bloc with Germany. Have you ever considered the possibility that that could end up being the case? That all of these other EUs, especially within Eastern Europe, that the UK will be the greater attractor to these nations than Germany because people feel so alienated by Merkel. The UK should pose as the good guys here, leave the EU, say to the others, hey, you should hold your own votes. Look, we're just fine over here in this island, because you will be. Your economy's not going to stall out because you left the European Union. You'll be just fine at that point. And you can say, well, you should join us instead. We'll formulate something that's more fair than all this nonsense going on in Brussels. It would work. It could easily work. These countries can leave. They can hold their own votes to stay in or out. And most of them, I predict, will leave. The Polish will leave. The Hungarians and the Czechs will probably leave. Some of these others, many of these states, the French could leave the EU. That would leave just basically Germany and Germany's vassals at that point, which would be funny to see because their currency would be so grossly overvalued they'd collapse almost immediately. Even the Austrians at this point, they might choose to side with a nation like the UK over their own sort of fatherland, Germany. Now, if that happens, then Merkel would certainly be quite sad. So yes, you should vote leave. That's about all. Peace.